to forgive me. Stay here.
Ali. Swadika, sorry for some technical issue that you may not see my face right now. We are fixing the technical problem. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rose Chitanuwat. I am the project director for the livestock series in Informa Markets in Asia. You may have been aware that we are the organizer of Livestock Asia, Livestock Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, and VIETSTOCK from Vietnam and Livestock Philippines in Manila. So right now the situation for Philippines and Malaysia show, we are going to postpone the show to 2021. You can follow us with the social media we have. For VIETSTOCK now, we continuously will organize the show as Vietnam has very positive feedback that the government is start letting people getting in and can do the local exhibition only. However, we will keep you updated and inform you about the status of the show. More than that, what we have to inform you that from the presentation before I appear in, you may see that we are adapt to the virtual online exhibition. The first version of online exhibition will represent for the international that would like to meet the visitor from Philippines. So there will be the online exhibition during 28 to 30 July this month. So it will be the 3 days online exhibition, which you can have the exhibition that putting in your laptop. So you can access from anywhere in the world. In exhibitors that joining our Livestock Philippines, unfortunately with the ASF and also continue us with our volcano and COVID now, and the government already announced to protect the industry by not allowing exhibition on the livestock sector. So we are going to put it online platform this year in July 28 to 30. And we're gonna come live physical event again in next year in May 26 to 28. So let's see again. Today for the Poultry Week webinar, this is our fourth session that will focus on the technical aspect for managing layer for the better and efficient production. So the production of the layer will be putting in together by using nutrition, animal health in order to improve the genetic to get the genetic potential. So lighting is also the main reason of improving the production. So I would like to bring you in the starting of the technical session, which we get the guest speaker from one of the genetic companies. They are working a lot on the genomics lighting program and improving the genetic for layers for Asia market. The speaker today is Dr. Seiche Genger. He will speak on the managed lighting in layers. And if you're interested in sharing this presentation, I have put the YouTube that you can share after this session. So may I invite Dr. Seiche Genger, the Southeast Asia Technical Manager from Highlight International, to share on the managing lighting in layers.
Thank you, Ms. Rose, for that introduction. I appreciate it. So yeah, kind of to mirror exactly what you said, today we are going to talk a little bit how lights can improve the performance in our poultry layer houses. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. All right, so obviously today we're going to talk about poultry lighting. As Ms. Rose shared, I am the Technical Services Manager for Southeast Asia. So I normally base out of Bangkok and cover all of Southeast Asia as well as a few other countries. So hopefully I'll have the opportunity to interact with some of you at your farms and help you out with some production problems, or certainly with one of my team members as well. We have some other people located in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and the Philippines who also travel around when we're not having issues with COVID. So we're here, we're available. I'm hoping that today you'll learn a little bit more about some lighting resources and then also where to go to get other information if you need it. All right. So with that, the outline of today's talk is really going to be focused on first the poultry biology and how that's affected by light, then about understanding some basic light principles themselves to know how to talk about this in the future if you want to go into greater depth. Then we'll make some recommendations on lighting programs and how you potentially might choose a program for yourself. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the implications and the addition of midnight feeding using lights to help promote some early body weight growth, or also just helping your birds eat a little bit more, especially when they're in heat stress conditions and might be a bit backed off. So with that, we'll start with this first slide, which is a representation of the wavelength of light that humans recognize. So it's got one confined solid peak there at the beginning, which is centered around 500 to 560 nanometers in length. And that's the wavelength that's actually reaching your eye. Birds, on the other hand, have a much different spectrum that they see. You can see just from this representation, there are 3 peaks here, not just a single one that people have. And this is the overlap between the two. So underneath the dotted line is what we see as humans, and the solid black line shows what birds are exposed to. So there's a lot more light that birds are seeing that potentially we are not aware of when we walk into the poultry houses. And that's important information to keep in mind as we discuss these things going forward, because just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not impacting our birds. So that brings us to this differencing in terminology. So there's actually lux, which is what many of you might have heard of before for measuring light. And then there's also something called clux. I kind of love that it is called clux because it's a little bit of a pun, but it means chicken lux, essentially. And where this term clux comes from is because the International Commission on Illumination, the standard for measuring light intensity, is set at the human peak response, which, as we looked at from the charts earlier, that response is calculated to be between 550 and 560 nanometers for that spectral peak. Chickens, on the other hand, have those 3 phototopic peaks, and those occur around 560, 480, and 625 on the other side. And so we need to add in some additional calculations to prepare for the fact that they are being exposed to more light. And when that becomes very interesting, is you can see that you can actually have a 50% or greater difference between a lux level reading and a clux level reading, which means that even though our lux meter is telling us this, our birds might be getting exposed to way, way more than that. So it's just important to keep some of those things in mind when you're looking at evaluating your poultry facility specifically. So moving on to basic poultry biology and how light affects the birds physiologically. The first thing light does seems fairly obvious, but it's true. Light facilitates food search. If we don't have light and we can't see, because that's how the basis of sight works, you have light that comes into your eyes and reflects back and sends a message to our brains that allows us to create an image. And that facilitation of sight with light is what allows us to find food and water, for that matter. So at the end of the day, our primary goal for any sort of chicken production is for a bird to find food and either to eat and grow or eat, grow, and lay eggs. So we need to have that food search capability. The next important thing that we need to remember when dealing with poultry is that we have to have a stimulation of our internal cycles, meaning we want to have a normal circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm is critically important to mammalian species, to avian species like poultry, and they allow us to set an internal body rhythm that keeps us healthy and keeps our different systems functioning appropriately. And these are set by day length changes, which is of course based on light. The last thing we want to really consider when we talk about poultry light in our houses is that this light is going to be responsible for both initiation and then later regulation of hormone release. So it's responsible for a lot of metabolic regulation, specifically that around fat and muscle deposition. It has extremely important effects on reproduction, which, as you can imagine, laying eggs would be a part of. So very, very critical to us in the laying business. And then it also has important effects on calcium, phosphorus, and bone formation processes. So how does it work? Well, the first thing that happens in reception is you have retinal exposure. So light comes in and hits the retina in the eye. This visual perception that gets created via transmission to the brain that creates our images is very important. And then the other thing that occurs when that happens is we get a dopamine release, and also we have UVA light that's affecting our melatonin release. Those things then interact with 2 separate but combined systems, which are the pineal gland and the hypothalamic gland, or center really, hypothalamus. So the pineal gland has photoreceptors that receive light at a wavelength, or at an intensity rather, over 4 lux. And that's what's setting our circadian clock. So serotonin and melatonin are being released by the pineal gland as it responds to the light intensity in the environment. The hypothalamus is what's going to be responsible for our sexual maturity and for those parameters. There are deep encephalic receptors that are receiving light in the hypothalamus, and that's causing stimulation and regulation of our sexual hormones, which then go to our ovary and other glands in order to create appropriate maturation and sexual processes like laying an egg. So wavelength differences are going to have some effect. The type of light that they receive is going to create different signals. So for example, ultraviolet light has a much shorter wavelength. And so it actually is going to have some control in terms of vitamin D conversion, calcium and phosphorus metabolism, bone formation, immune system, blood pressure and circulation, and muscle development. So when we're talking about those sorts of things, we're really looking at ultraviolet AB light being the primary stimulators of that. Visual light, on the other hand, birds are going to use to see colors. They have what we call a tetrachromatic color vision because they have 4 different kinds of cones in the eye that receive that. They do have a 5th cone, and that's actually what they use for motion detection. And then lastly, you can have things like infrared light, which are going to be perceived as heat by the birds. So understanding light and how we want to talk about that. The first area I want to really discuss, or at least bring this concept in, is a luminescence power. So in this presentation, as you can see, there are a lot of intense concepts that can be a little difficult to understand. And my goal here is just to introduce you to the things that are out there to be considered and give a basic understanding. And so when I talk about a luminance power, I want you to be aware that what I'm talking about here is that you can have a different lux intensity based on how high your light is from the floor. So if you kind of look at this example, you can see we have the same light. They're both 100 lumens, and one of them is much further up from the floor than the other one, but they're both still giving off the same light intensity at the source of the bulb. So that bulb that's much closer to the ground has a more concentrated spotlight effect, and the light intensity at the ground is 100 lux, but only over a meter squared area. The same light bulb, when raised up off the floor quite a bit more, can cover a 10 meter squared area, but then at 1/10 of the light intensity, only 10 lux is being observed at that area on the floor where the light is spotlighted. So when we consider how we hang lights in our poultry houses, this is very important to understand that a 100 lumen light bulb does not act the same at 2 meters or 1 meter. They're going to have a different effect, and those are things we can measure and use to aid us in our production process. So how do we measure light? How do we walk into a house and figure out if we have the appropriate light intensity, if we have the appropriate levels, if it's different between cages? Well, we do have light meters available, and you can purchase these from a number of locations. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you pick a light meter later, but they're used to measure lux or foot candles commonly. And then there are also several different kinds. So the sad part here is that not all light meters are created equal. A traditional light meter, the one that you're going to find probably most easily or commonly, is only going to take into account the human vision spectrum for the peak at around 555 nanometers, meaning we might be missing that extra 50% of variation that would be specific to our poultry houses. So we do have animal-specific light meters that can calculate the full spectrum vision, but a lot of times those things are going to be more expensive. And I think good light meters really fall into the same level as all tools and scientific instruments. They're going to be priced accordingly based on what they can do and the amount of technology that goes into them. So my biggest piece of advice is if you want a piece of equipment that does it all, you're going to pay for that. So don't be taken in by something that seems very inexpensive, because I would have a concern that it wouldn't work. So in this case, for light meters, certainly for the most part, you do seem to get what you pay for. There's some other differences I want to bring up now, because these questions come up a lot, that not all light bulbs are the same. And that's true. Measuring LED light intensities, so getting meters to measure things, are also going to have a little bit of a variation there, because traditional light meters cannot be used to measure LED lights accurately in a poultry house. While most light meters are calibrated for visible light at the white color temperature, usually that's about 2800 Kelvin, and they're most closely associated with the 500 and 560 nanometer wavelengths, that it doesn't calibrate necessarily at the temperature that the LED light is going to give off. So that's something to be aware of. The good news is that any traditional light meter is going to give you a rough indication of light intensity. So I use it in a way where I take a light intensity and I'm like, okay, I'm probably close to the ballpark, but I'm not going to rely on that as being exactly what it needs to be. And because of that, it's still useful. Doing something or measuring something is better than doing nothing at all, right? Because our eyes are not going to be able to tell us what the light intensity is in terms of numbers that we need to adjust for our birds. Because of that, it's okay if you use something that's less accurate, but just be aware that it is less accurate and you might have to make more changes, or you might not be able to rely on that information as heavily as you would otherwise. So ideal light meters can be poultry specific or LED specific. The poultry specific spectrometers, there's a couple good brands that we've seen in the past that we tend to like, and those would be Once and Hato. I don't think there's another brand on the market, but I could be wrong on that. But those provide both lux and clux reading. They're also going to give you values like CCT, which is about the color of light given off, CRI, and then the peak wavelength. LED spectrometers are available and very expensive typically, but they're used by professional photographers, and they're going to give you readings for CCT, CRI, lux, and then again lambda P, which is peak wavelength, but they're not going to give you clux. However, you could probably be able to roughly assess that by observing the spectrum. I personally have a hard time overlaying those two graphs in my mind, and I like to use something that gives me a reading in clux to get that best representation. So I wanted to give you this kind of example because this is sort of the problem that I see without really intense planning when we talk about how to light our houses, especially in indoor houses, right? That's where we're focused the most on lighting, because you can't control a lot if you have an open house. You're going to get a tremendous amount of sunlight in, and we can't really control the intensity of that light. So lighting procedures become critically important for nighttime in open-sided houses, but then also primarily in closed-sided houses. We're going to need to focus on this. And so this is an example of a caged house. What we're looking at here is having two different light fixtures at the top, and then the top of this graph is going to represent the top row of cages, and the bottom one, row 6, is going to represent the cages that are on the floor level as you walk through the aisles. So looking at this was light intensity measurements at each source. The goal was to have an average of 20 to 30 lux per pen. So anything that you see here that is yellow is more than necessary. And then the orange is what you see that's in between that wavelength. And then red is not enough light. And what I want to direct your attention to is really those two cages in the middle of row 6. Even though we have two lights and many of our readings have a lot of lux, like those 150 or 125 at the top, you now have two cages down at the bottom that, depending on your stocking density, are receiving little to no stimulation at all at any point in time during the day. And what you see over time, if you take this set and you extrapolate that out to the size of a whole laying house, that is tens of cages that are now not receiving enough light stimulation, that potentially we're not getting the level of production out of them when we want. And I think all of us know here how much it can affect our bottom line and our profit to lose even 2% of our eggs that we could be getting. That's a lot of money that we leave on the table at the end of the day. And so this is why having good light intensity can really help us maintain a good peak that persists longer, and then also maintains good shell quality, good bone quality, things like that. So really important, especially when we're talking about cage lighting systems in closed houses, to have good light stimulation all the way through the cages. So this is kind of what I'm talking about again. This one doesn't have quite as many rows of cages as we do in some systems, but you can see you want good light dispersion all the way throughout so the birds on the bottom rows and the top rows receive good light. So another question I wanted to cover briefly is I get a lot of questions about painting bulbs red. So why do people paint their bulbs red, or why do they put in a red light? Well, there's a thought process that we can use red bulbs as a tool to dim lights and then prevent pecking. There's been studies in the past saying that red light seems to decrease the aggressive behavior on birds, but that's really just birds in the red light spectrum, not actually red light itself by painting the bulb. And also that dimming that light by painting them red, it is going to help decrease that pecking. And we do know that a dimmer light or a lower light intensity certainly will help us with aggression issues. But what's the actual effect of painting that bulb red? We've done some tremendous research at Highline. Dr. Rubinoff is responsible for a lot of this information. And the results that we found is in the experiments that we've done, where that red paint actually does create significant dimming, but it doesn't provide uniform dimming. So even if we painted all the lights in the house, we had different levels of light dimming throughout that weren't consistent. And that's not what we want. We want to have a reliable consistency throughout the entire house. We also found that the red paint's going to block almost all of the blue, green, and yellow light spectrum. And that level of cutoff is actually going to depend on what kind of paint you use. And I'm not sure how many of us are going to go out and check the light spectrum paint we have when we buy red paint. The other negative impact was that red paint is not creating any new red light spectrum. So whatever red light spectrum you already had in your bulb is only just going to be decreased. And that defies the purpose of using red light for its calming effect. So at the end of the day, just installing dimmable lights can accomplish the same types of effects, but you don't have to paint anything, you don't have to have extra labor, and you don't have to pay for new bulb cost. So using the lights you have, but using a positive dimmer switch in there, a quality dimmer, is going to help you just as much as painting the lights red, and it's also going to give you a much greater level of control. Let's talk briefly about dimming itself and then lens dispersion. So dimming LED lights is really where it gets tricky, because LED lights and incandescent lights are not the same. Dimmers need to be compatible if you have LED lights installed, because incompatible dimmers are going to cause LED lights to flicker, they could overheat, and they could burn out more quickly. However, incandescent lights act as a resistor. They have a filament internally, and that is a simple resistor is how that acts, meaning that it helps decrease the wattage coming through the bulb itself to create light. And so with a dimmer switch, having a variation in your wattage isn't as big of a deal, because that resistor is going to moderate that in some ways. With an LED light, however, they are not simple resistors on the inside of the light. And so if you have a very high level of variation in your country or in your region on the amount of wattage that comes through, if that's not a very, very consistent energy flow into your lights, you can have some flickering and some issues there that may bother the birds that you personally can't even perceive. So when using dimmers for LED lights, critically important that you get a good quality dimmer. They can work fantastic. I highly recommend them, but not something you want to mess around with too much if you think you can't control the wattage input coming in. So lens dispersion, what is this? Lens dispersion is how much light we're going to allow to move in a certain direction. So you can use a reflective background at different angles inside the bulb that is going to disperse light in certain patterns. So a 180-degree bulb is very different than a 30-degree bulb because it has different focuses on that light. Lights with a high level of light dispersion include CFL lights and incandescent lights. This directionality can be useful or detrimental depending on what you're trying to do with it. So directional bulbs can be really helpful because they can save us on our energy costs by focusing light where it's needed and not just dispersing it randomly. So we need more bulbs or more energy to increase our intensity. We can have good intensity in a specific direction. And it matters in both floor and cage houses, because if we're on a floor house and you have effects like spotlighting because of your directionality, you're going to leave areas of the house where they're going to be dark and you might end up with floor eggs. If you're in cages, you end up with cages that are too light or too dark if that directionality is too narrow. So what do we want to use? For brooding, it's ideal to use a light that has a very wide angle of distribution because we want to have a nice even light source across all the birds, because during brooding, what we're trying to do is facilitate sight, to find food, to find water, to set up a nice circadian rhythm to let them know what time of day it is. So usually using bulbs that have a greater than 270-degree angle are going to ensure we get good equal light distribution throughout the cages. The lights that are currently in pullet houses that we see usually are usually less than 180-degree dispersion, and this just doesn't get us enough light. So here's a quick example of not the best light dispersion. You can see in the photo on the left-hand side that the feed trough has way too much shadow. It's hard for me looking at this photo to even see that there's feed in there, which makes it also less exciting and enticing to the birds. We were able to solve the problem in this particular poultry house by just increasing the height of the light bulb a few centimeters. And now we had good illumination based on the dispersion to cover the feed and to stimulate activity inside those cages. So again, that light inside the cage is very important. With our baby birds or our older birds, they need to know where to go to find food and where to find water. So we want to make sure we have the same light intensity as recommended in the guides for our management of any of these strains of birds, whether it be highline or Loman or ISA. Everybody needs to have an appropriate light intensity inside the cages to facilitate their sight. So now how do we design a lighting program, right? This is the important part. We've talked about all of the basics for setting up lighting and how we go through that and a basic understanding of how lights work. The lighting program, how do you figure it out? Well, the most important thing I can tell you to do is please, please, please plan your lighting program before the chicks arrive. We don't want any confusion with our employees, with our labor about what we should do when the birds are already there, because we're behind the ball now. So important to go ahead and make sure everything is planned out. In order to plan that program, we need to understand the impact of light on pullet growth and development, which is something that we've started that process on today, understanding that light is going to affect these issues. And then always, probably the most critically important, we use light to stimulate birds to go into reproduction. And we need to do that only when the body weight is appropriate for that stimulation, because body weight goals are going to what is going to determine the success of that bird coming in, having an appropriate peak and maintaining good persistency. So always, always, always wait to stimulate your birds until you've reached the body weight goals as recommended by the genetics company. So planning that program. First, we got to agree on what outcome is wanted for the pullets. Obviously, those things are body weight goals, right? And then growth goals. So all that should be set out for you in your management guides. You want to go and print out a clear lighting program. You can find many of these on our Highline website. We have recommendations, and I'm happy to share those as well. And you'll see some examples of our lighting programs I use in Southeast Asia fairly commonly in a few slides. And then the most important thing to me, after you've printed out your lighting program, this is what I ask to see in every facility. Show me your lighting program. Every time you make a change, have somebody initial next to that change to show that it was done. If you can just start these checks and balances, it can help you so much in the future. It seems like an annoying thing to do sometimes, but having that responsibility to check and then ensure that it's been checked is really, really critical to being successful. Because you might have the best lighting program written down in the world, but it doesn't mean anything if it's not being done correctly. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things that I recommend and use the most often in Southeast Asia. The first one is one that is not as common as I'd like it to be, which is that in the first 7 to 10 days, we use what's called an intermittent lighting program. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. And then after that 7 to 10 days, we want to return to a recommended program by Highline. What's the advantages of using intermittent light? Well, first I better tell you what intermittent light means. It means that we're actually going to turn off the lights for a couple hours, then leave them on, and then turn them off for a couple hours, leave them on. And we actually do that for 4 different sets during the day during a closed house, or 3 times during a lighthouse that has open sides. So the reason we do that rather than giving them 24 hours of light during the first week is because it's going to start creating this normal pattern of rest and activity. We're kind of jump starting that response from the pineal gland to create sleep and awake times using that melatonin serotonin response. It also then creates synchronized chick behavior. And that is exactly what we want. We always want our birds to be doing the same things at the same times and having that same behavior so that we can get all of our eggs at the same time and having good uniformity, having good growth. Another benefit is if all of our behavior is synchronized and the lights come on, so all of the birds get up at the same time, the weak chicks that might have wanted to just sleep are going to have so many birds getting up around them, they're going to get pushed to feed and water by those larger chicks, which hopefully is going to help us reduce our early mortality and keep our CVs up. We've had really, really great success with improving our body weights early on, especially, and improving uniformity in countries that normally have struggled with that in the past, simply by incorporating this intermittent lighting program using a very inexpensive light timer in the beginning of the brooding process. So this is what that program looks like in a closed house. So again, there's no outside light involved here. So what you can see is we turn the lights off for 2 hours, and then we have them on for 4 hours. And this just alternates throughout the day. So 2 hours off, 4 hours on, 2 hours off, 4 hours on. And the goal for that being the chicks are going to sleep when the lights are off, and then they're going to get up, normal activity, lots of time to find food and water, and then go to bed again. And we find this really helps us create that synchronization and drive good early feed intake and good early uniformity. In an open house, you simply take out the dark night time period during the middle of the day because you can't make the house dark at that point. So as soon as you get to the evening time between, looks like 1700 and 1900, you're going to have a nice dark period. And then again, at the midnight to 1 a.m. hour, and then later in the morning, the last kind of bit before the sun comes up. So between 3 and 5 a.m., you're going to have that darkness. So that's really the plan for an open house. So after the first week, after that first 7 to 10 days, we don't want to stay in that bind where we're giving them interrupted sleep. We've done a number of studies in the poultry community on sleep and its effects on bird health, feed intake, feed conversion, and growth. Sleep's essential. So giving them a normal full night's rest as soon as possible is going to be incredibly important to the immune system. It's going to drive that feeding behavior because when the lights come on, I'm going to jump up and eat. And then we've also seen that birds will learn when the lights are going to go off and they'll plan accordingly. So even in broilers or other meat birds, we've seen that they will actually eat a whole lot more before going to bed and then get better feed conversions and still maintain good gains because they'll be digesting that feed at night. And that is going to create better GI transit time and better absorption of that feed. So good driving of feeding behavior, getting our birds in a normal pattern and encouraging them to sleep a nice long period of time at once is going to help us support health overall. So this is what a standard program looks like for a closed-sided house for the Highline Brown. And I like this graph because it's a really nice visual representation that shows me I have my first week of my intermittent lighting. So you can see that off, on setup with the hours of the day. On the bottom, you can see that it's week 1 versus, so 7 days, week 2, week 3, week 4. So nice little blocks. Each one of those set is that week and age. And then below that is how many grams the standard is as well. So at 2 weeks, we should have a normal standard of about 129 grams. And then under that, again, if you don't like reading it in the little blocks up above, you can see that they have 17 hours of light at that 2 week period of time. So this shows we have our intermittent lighting program in the first week, and then we want to drop immediately to 6 hours of darkness. So they were getting truly 8 hours before, but now we're going to go to a 6 hour continuous program starting at 7 days of age. And then each week thereafter, we're going to do a nice, slow, consistent step down until we get down to about 10 hours of light at 9 weeks of age. And then we're going to hold at that level until it's the right time to light stimulate them. For the Highline Brown, we recommend stimulation at right about 1,350 grams. So that 1,340 area that you see on the graph is totally appropriate. And that happens at 15 weeks. At that point, we recommend doing a 2 hour jump up, a nice big intensity increase right away. Seem to have good stimulation, seems to help also with not having so much obesity issues later. That's a nice way to do this. And then after we start lighting, it's just a simple step up program to the recommended 16 hours of light. And then for the rest of their life on, 16 hours of light is the appropriate amount. Now, What about a closed house? You may not be able to, I mean, an open house, sorry. You may not be able to get all the way down to 10 hours of light. Well, it looks exactly the same, except as you can see on the left-hand side, this is in Bahasa, you can see on the left-hand side that the lights are on for a much longer period of time during the day. You miss that middle of the day darkness during the first 7 days of life. But then after that, the program is pretty much exactly the same. You just stop at 12 hours of light, or whatever the light program is during the summer for you, the number of light hours in the day the birds are going to experience. Many countries in Southeast Asia are close enough to the equator that you don't have a tremendous amount of variation, although that's not true for every region. So 12 hours of light in an open-sided house is what you drop down to. But again, you can see when those birds have obtained 1,340 grams or a little bit more at 15 weeks, we then still want to add 2 hours of light to really pop up that stimulation and get to where we need to be. After that, we do a slow climb up to 16 hours of light again. So now for our last topic here briefly is midnight feeding. This is a tool I want to talk to you about because even with the best lighting programs, sometimes our regions are incredibly hot, or we may have other issues to deal with that our birds just aren't eating enough. Well, you can use light to really add in some extra time to eat. So this is a program, we call it midnight feeding because typically we feed at midnight, but the goal is that we're actually going to add some extra light in during the coolest part of the day. So that's what's most critical. It does not have to be at the midnight hour. If the coolest part of the day is at 3 in the morning, you can have your lights come on from 3 to 5 in the morning. That's fine. So we start this program as soon as the chicks have 7 hours of darkness in total, which happens week 2 according to our Highline guidelines. The reason for this is we need to have at least 4 hours prior to the lights coming on to allow a full deep sleep to come through. And then we pop in 1 hour of midnight feeding to start. After that, we want another 2 hours of darkness to let them go back to sleep, finish out that rest. It's really critical that we don't wake the birds up and then put them back to sleep during this time in their life. We can do that early on, but after that first week it can be really detrimental in the end. And we want to make sure they have a good sleep period, which is why they need that first 4 hours, and then they're definitely going to need at least the second 2 hours after. But this will stimulate feed intake. They'll pop up, they'll think that it's morning, and they'll go to those feeders. And we've seen improvements of almost 2 to 5 grams per day in terms of body weight gain by adding in this midnight feeding. And again, the most critical portion of that is that it's going to allow feeding during cooler times of the day. So those are the primary topics I really wanted to cover today. I hope that this has been a helpful, brief introduction to lighting. There are so many more technical bulletins and documents and a tremendous wealth of information you can find on our Highline website. And it's just highline.com. And I think you'll be able to get plenty of information from the technical library there if you want to go into more depth on these sorts of topics. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the team and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Seiche. There are a few of questions, probably like I need to inform you that most of the audience here are from Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and even Myanmar. So the question is basically from most of our ASEAN audience. So we have around 10 minutes for the question and answer. First question is, as you introduce the lighting program, so the question is a bit wider. It's like, what is the major difference from using traditional lighting methods?
So I think that's an interesting question. From which location, or could you elaborate a little bit on what your traditional lighting methods you'd like to discuss are? Because I've seen several different plans based on different countries and locations.
That is why I said the question from the audience is very wide and very general. So I think I would suggest that for the audience who asks about the traditional light, the difference on the lighting method, you may email to Seiche and in the basic condition that you want her to compare on. That would be better.
Yes, that would be helpful. I'll give you a brief overview first, just to give you, based it on what I've seen from my times in different countries. So I think the most common thing that I see across all of those countries, across Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Korea as well, a lot of times what I see is a 24-hour lighting program that goes on for a long period of time. So I've been in a lot of poultry houses where the birds arrive at the first day and they may have 25 hours of light up until they're 5 weeks old or 6 weeks old. And those types of lighting programs do not allow for sleep. And my best example of this or discussion, because I've had many situations, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in the USA and in Europe, where people have said, but I walk into the house and the birds are sleeping. And I said, well, yeah, they're going to sleep with the lights on, but it's just like you or me. If we were to fall asleep at night with all the lights on in our house, maybe on the couch or after watching TV or something like that, we don't sleep very well. I don't feel deeply rested when I've slept with all the lights on very brightly. And so that's why having the lights off is actually going to give our birds a better, deeper sleep. And it's very important. So 24-hour lighting programs, which are traditional in a lot of locations. And certainly if you're looking at broiler houses, there's a lot of belief that if I don't have my lights on for 24 hours, my birds aren't going to continue eating enough. And this isn't true. Your birds are going to develop a normal circadian rhythm. They're going to have good feed intake still, and they're actually going to end up with better feed utilization because of that sleep. And they also have a much lower risk of getting diseases because they're going to have a stronger immune system supported by that sleep. So unless somebody wants to have a more specific lighting program that's traditional to them, I would say that's the most common one I see across the region is far too long periods of time with too much light. Sorry, Ms. Rose, your speaker is still muted.
Sorry. So come to the next question. I think it's a bit related on the first question. Is it necessary to do the light stimulation program in the layer burst for the open-sided poultry house?
Yes, that's a great question. And it's something that we deal with a lot. I spend a lot of time in open-sided houses, right? It's Southeast Asia. This is very common. This is what we see. And a lot of our farms are older facilities. And while many people are building new closed-sided houses, they're very expensive. It's hard to do that full upgrade. So yeah, closed-sided houses, it makes perfect sense. But open-sided houses, it's actually even more critical to me. One of the big problems that I see in an open-sided house is you get 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of nighttime. And so people either have no lights at all, and that means 12 hours of darkness for their chicks day one all the way through, or they have 24 hours of light where the birds aren't getting any sleep. So we've talked about the first half. If you have only 24 hours of light all the time because you leave your lights on all night long, our birds never develop appropriate sleep patterns. The opposite situation, if we don't have a nice step down program, we don't get the normal rhythms sent to the bird's hypothalamus, triggering it to know it's time to be stimulated, it's time to come up into production. So if we remember back to that early slide that I showed with the hypothalamus being stimulated and being the releaser of sex hormones, what happens is that at 12 hours, 12 hours, 12 hours, 12 hours, the light never stimulates the hypothalamus, and all the birds might come in a little bit differently. Now, genetically, these birds have fantastic potential to produce and come in around the same time in age. But if you use light, we can ensure that that peak is nice and uniform and rapid because you stimulate all the birds at the same time. And not having a lighting program is going to give you a much less uniform peak, and it's going to hurt your production and your bottom line profit at the end of the life of that flock.
All right, thank you. And next question to that is, how is the cost effect on that if the small scale open house doing that?
Yeah. So the effect of that is going to be the number of eggs that you're going to lose by the end of the life of the flock. And that's something that's going to be different for every operation, because depending on your lighting program and how ununiform it is or how uniform it is, depending on how you're doing with your body weights and your immune system health, it could be as tremendous of an impact that you could improve by 10%. Or it could be that everything else is perfect. It's a really easy flock, and the normal daylight hours for you helped you out for that one flock. And so you end up with maybe only a 2% loss. That's going to be specific to each individual location. Me personally, it would not matter to me if I had 1,000 birds or 1,000,000 birds. I want every egg I can get out of those. That's how I make my money at the end of the day, because each one of those hens is eating feed. She's costing me money. I might need to use medication. And my value from her is getting back the maximum number of eggs she can give me. And I know I can achieve that by using a quality lighting program.
All right. So it's about the production performance as well, not just on the cost that investing, but the production can even get more and better quality. That I would
Absolutely.
say. Yeah. So the next question is, Dr. Seiche, is can light intensity affect the layers production as well? If so, its effect, how do you adjust? How do you recommend to adjust according to the duration of the light?
Yep. So we have different light intensity regulations or recommendations rather based on the age of the bird. And you can see that in the lighting programs that there is a different lux intensity recommended for each station. Obviously on open-sided houses, we can't control the intensity. They're going to get the intensity that the outdoors receives. So there are different effects, and they're also going to have different behavior effects. So normal recommendations during the rearing phase are going to be between 20 and 40 lux, depending. It could also be lower, as in 20 to 30. It could also be a little bit higher. And I'm not being very specific here because different strains, so again, different genetics companies, their birds respond better to different intensities, and we have to balance that. So my recommendation for what intensities to use are to go to the website of the breed that you're using and find their recommendations or talk to that local representative. For highline birds, we have all of that information there. It's very clear, and we can also help moderate and make changes if you see behavioral issues related to that. So I'll again direct you to our website for any information you want about highline bird intensity for lighting.
Okay, now I think you have presented a bit already. The question is about what is the best light intensity lux in the rearing, growing period and laying period?
So let me see if I can share my screen again, or maybe I don't need to share it. I can just pull it up.
You can share the screen as well to be easy for audience to catch up.
Yep, I'm trying to see if I can find if it was on here, and it doesn't look like I have it, but it is in the highlight guideline, and so I don't want to tell you the wrong numbers off the top of my head, but we use a little bit of a lower intensity earlier on, and then we increase intensity to that 20-30 range and hold there for a bit, and then we'll actually drop it back down a touch. Again, all of that is varied based on if you're having problems or potentially if you don't have good light dispersion and we're not reaching appropriate lux intensity throughout the house.
All right. So this is a question in related to the general things as well, that the audience said most of the genetics companies always recommend on the lux, but not clux. Do you know why?
The reason that they recommend on lux is because there are not many light meters available that work in clux. They're very, very expensive. And so we don't have an expectation that most producers are going to have that. I recommend it if you want to get very, very in-depth in your poultry lighting programs. But a great place to start is a basic light meter. Not to mention, most lighting companies don't make poultry specific lights, although we do have some now, and I think some members of those companies are on this call. And I think it's very, very important to make sure that our recommendations are based on a measurement that is easily accessible to all of our customers worldwide, like lux or foot candles would be.
I think nowadays there is a lot of innovative on lux meter, and if the poultry house ready to invest, they can buy that special lighting as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So come to the, I think we're gonna have time for another 4 questions on, question is about bulb. How you determine the bulb direction? The bulb direction for the lighting, how you
The bulb?
determine the angle, the bulb.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah, between the bulb angle and stuff. So that's what we discussed a little bit earlier. I can give you the recommendations that we make. So for most pullet houses, so if you're doing the brooding phase, we want to have really good open light dispersion. So which means that we want our bulbs to be at least greater than 270 degrees. Many of them that we see normally that people purchase are only 180 degrees dispersion. So that's our recommendation there, is to have open light dispersion. In terms of if you're using different angled light dispersion or different bulbs, my recommendation is just be sure that you're not creating problems for yourself. So the first one being, which things do we need to illuminate? We need good light in the cages that creates appropriate light intensity at all points in the cage and at all floor levels. If you remember the graph I showed where you had yellow at the top and red at the bottom, a light that's dispersing light and never interacts with the bottom cage is going to cause us a lot of loss in egg numbers. Same thing goes for that feed trough example. We want good illumination on the feed trough and on the water. We want good, easy access to those items. So that's kind of how I would go about choosing bulbs or light dispersion, is first working with somebody who knows a lot about poultry lighting to help you make sure that your house and the design of your house is getting appropriate targeting with light for those birds. Same thing if you have a parent stock house perhaps, or a grandparent stock house, and you're going for floor eggs or going to reduce floor egg intervention, but you're growing birds to lay eggs on the floor. If you create spotlights, light areas and dark areas, you'll create areas where birds are going to lay more on the floor, and that's going to cause you problems in the long run and losses to dirty eggs and contamination.
All right. So now it's talking about the tunnel vent house. There is a question from audience asking about the light traps. Light traps. They said that they see that owners of the tunnel vent house always remove the light traps because to reduce the risk of less air going in. So can you have any recommendation on that, or they are doing the right thing?
So again, what I'm going to tell you is that it's going to be very specific to your individual operation. So when we have light traps in place, they're definitely going to affect our static pressure. They're going to affect our ability to pull air in a tunnel ventilated house. And you might have to have potentially more issues in terms of pulling enough air through that you don't wear out your fans, or you might have more electricity cost if you don't have the right size fans or it's not calibrated correctly, because those light traps are blocking in air that might be coming in from the outside, making your house quote unquote much tighter, and your static pressure is going to be more intense. So when we remove light traps, what we're doing is we allow freer airflow to come through the system, and it's going to put less pressure on your fans, but you also may be giving up then your static pressure and your ability to pull air for appropriate bird cooling. So that's the effect of the light traps on your ventilation system. Now, if we're removing light traps, that means we're going to have an extra light source in there. They're not going to be light tight, which is going to affect your control over your light intensity. In general, you need to know for your operation which one is going to cause you more harm and more problems. And that's an individual farm basis. Sorry, you're still muted, Ms. Rose.
The next question is about the impact of flickering. The audience asks, like, they have not heard before about the impact on flickering. Flickering.
Flickering,
so
yeah.
Yeah, flickering. I'm worried about my pronunciation.
No.
What is your take on this about putting the bird on stress when mentioned about impact of flickering?
Yeah, I think the impact of flickering is quite significant, actually. And my best example would be, think about being in a conference room or an office space, and the light bulb is constantly flickering and flashing, I know it certainly can give me a headache, and it can be very aggravating and annoying. And what's difficult, especially when we have a poor dimmer or an inappropriate dimmer on an LED light, that flickering, you and I, half the time we can't even see it. We cannot even perceive it. But to the birds, it's the same as being in that office with the light bulb constantly flickering and buzzing at you. And it's just aggravating. So I can't imagine living in that for a year. And I certainly wouldn't want my birds to. And we have seen there have been studies done that show that flickering effect can really affect production in breeder birds, whether they be meat birds, so broiler breeders, turkeys, and egg-laying birds as well. So anything that is going to aggravate your bird and potentially give them a massive headache is a negative. We really want to prevent flickering wherever possible. And remember, just because you can't see the flickering doesn't mean it's not there. So always, always, always work with a lighting specialist or somebody who's very, very comfortable with understanding flow through to prevent flickering.
All right. So the next question is, the audience asks you about the ideal lighting program for the free range layer.
Yes. The ideal lighting program for the free range layer is going to be the same as it is for your open-sided house birds. So ideally, depending on your free range system, this is becoming more popular in many countries around the world. If your free range birds are birds that are outside all the time, and then you bring them into what's called a chicken tractor at night, right? You bring them into a coop at night, then you need to arrange your lighting program to make sure when they come in for nighttime, they're coming in appropriately to your lighting schedule. If your free range program is regulated by government controls that say, okay, you can have a poultry house, but then they have to have this light entrance or exit open for this number of hours a day, or they have to be outside for this number of hours a day, you're going to have a much harder time controlling it. But we can work with individual standards to try and create a program that suits your needs. In general, what you can do is you can add light when they go back into the houses, and that's how we get our best control there. But as long as your government regulations allow for it, and we can bring those birds into houses sooner at different growth cycles, or different times during the growth cycle, we can create the same lighting program. It's just a matter of personal management of your employees and the birds.
All right, come to the next question. I think this is a real experience that happened with the layer in most of the farm in Asia. In the closed house system, they always transfer the pullet to laying, right? So in ASEAN, it's like they won't transfer at the daytime. They will turn the light and transfer the chick at the nighttime. So how you recommend on the impact of that lighting disruption, because that is very critical period as well for use lighting to stimulate the egg production.
So what I see is that chickens, as much as we like to make fun of them for dying a lot and having mortality rates, they say that they don't always like to live. They're actually quite resilient animals, and they're very, very capable at dealing with a lot of stressors. So my concern with lighting programs and what I see that happens from the time of moving from the pullet house into the lay house is actually those two farms.
Seiche, I think there is some sound issue. Can you close mic and open the mic and answer again? Because it is like disrupting on your answer. Yep.
Hear me better now. Let's try this. How about now?
Let's try again.
All right, any benefit?
No. I think it's like the echo and the line is like vibrating. Let me check from the audience. Can any audience say like the sound is okay or? Not okay. I think there is some problem with this. What I will put on this, Seiche, would you mind if you type the answer in email? I will blast to all of the audience today. All right. I think some technical problem with your microphone is start like everyone say not okay.
Is it better now?
No, it's like something wrong. Anyway, I can share with you. It is like Gabret. It's like anyway. So dear Seiche, so thank you very much for today's presentation and very fruitful question and answer session that you have provided a lot. So I will send you send the question or even through us. But the last question, I think many people is waiting for the answer. So right now, I would like to say thank you very much for our audience here and our lovely speaker. And I hope to stay tuned with us with this afternoon on the nutrition for layer. Thank you very much. ขอบคุณค่ะ